Hello, everyone. My name is Amir Jarad. I'm here with Professor Stavins. We're here with the first episode of Head in the Clouds. And without further ado, here we go. Now, Professor Stavins, could you tell us a bit about yourself?
So I'm currently and have been for 35 years a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School at Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm an environmental economist. My PhD is in economics, also from Harvard. Before this, I did many other things. When I graduated college, I joined the Peace Corps and served in West Africa for about 4.5 years. And then eventually I found my way to working at the Environmental Defense Fund, an environmental advocacy group. This was in Berkeley, California. They've since moved to San Francisco, that office. And then from there, I skipped it. I did a master's degree in agricultural economics at Cornell before I went to EDF. And then after EDF, after the Environmental Defense Fund, I became a graduate student. I studied for the PhD in economics at Harvard. I graduated in 1988 and immediately joined the faculty, and I've been here ever since. And I direct the Harvard Environmental Economics program and the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements and our joint degree program with the business school and also our PhD program. So I keep busy.
Yeah, with that being said, I had no idea you were in the Peace Corps. Could you tell me a bit about that experience? Was that during the Vietnam War?
No, it was, well, it may have well still been Vietnam. I'm not sure about that. But the reality is that it was the two most important experiences of my life. The other one being getting married and having children.
Hmm.
But it was a fantastic experience. It changed me. I wouldn't be where I am now were it not for that. As an undergraduate, I studied physics and philosophy. I never took a economics course. I wasn't particularly interested in environment. And it was just a fantastic experience. And I commend it to students today. The Peace Corps still exists. Its budget is similar to what it was then, believe it or not. So in real dollars, it's much smaller, but it's still going strong, and it's a wonderful experience from Americans for Americans because Americans tend to be very isolated from the rest of the world, compared to people in many parts of the world, such as particularly in Europe, where everyone knows two languages minimum. Um, but in the U.S., historically, at least since World War II, we've been very insular and sometimes xenophobic for that matter. And
So,
the Peace Corps cures you of all that.
yeah, off of that note, so would you say the Peace Corps kind of like planted the seed for your awareness in the environment and everything regarding that? Because like
Yeah,
West
it did.
Africa.
It did because I was in Sierra Leone, country in West Africa, and I experienced firsthand the trade-offs between economic development and the quality of the environments. Economic development can help with environmental quality, but there also can be trade-offs, and I experienced that firsthand.
Would you say that economic development kind of directly impacts the nation, or is it just a portion of it that impacts the nation? Does most of it go to other countries, more like first world
Oh, this
countries?
was localized. It was localized. It was the big environmental problems in most developing countries, even now, are indoor air pollution from using biomass for cooking fires
Mm.
and exposure to small particulate matter. This affects mainly women and children who are in those kitchens. And about 10 to 20 million people will die next year of premature mortality as a result. And the other is water pollution, largely as a result of inadequate sanitation. This is not in the small villages like where I was, but in the big cities. And their poor sanitation results in chronic dysentery and for young people. And so children, again, it's 10 to 20 million people. So those are the big environmental problems in most developing countries. Those are not the only ones, but those are the ones that stand out.
So one of the main things too is this like a rising trend, or is this just a decreasing trend, or is it just flat line? Is this becoming a worse
Well,
problem for all of
so
us now?
as large urban areas have become even larger, and some of the countries in the developing world are among the largest cities in the world. As those have increased, so too have some of these environmental problems. The use of biomass is still very, very common in sub-Saharan for cooking in sub-Saharan Africa. And with that, without any kind of adequate ventilation, this is an open fire inside a small grass mud hut or the like. Um, and also biomass for cooking is very, very common in India and parts of Southeast Asia.
So it's kind of also regional too. Like certain areas have this
Yeah,
issue, other areas don't. Okay,
yeah, yeah.
that's a pretty good way of taking a look at that. Um, what do you think the solution is? Is there even a solution anytime soon? Is that possible that we can get to one? Or
Well, this is one of those cases in which economic growth is probably the best solution for the cooking fires with biomass, because when people are able to afford, as they have, and we've seen this in India, we certainly see it in China, but in many other parts of the world, can afford instead a basic kerosene stove rather than just using biomass, burning local wood or dung, then that helps tremendously. Or when they become even more wealthy and actually have, either natural gas or electricity for stoves, then that takes care of it. There are other issues, obviously, that come up, but in terms of localized air pollution. And with the water pollution, that tends also to be better. As societies get richer, are able to do a better job with treating what is essentially wastewater. And whether it's recycling it or it's properly disposing of it, that tends to go along with economic development.
so off of that note of economic development, kind of what I'm looking at is what's the publicity like behind this? Do we know, and kind of in the West, more so around the whole world, do we know that this is this big of an issue? And why hasn't it gotten more publicity? This is all news to me that this is even a
Oh,
problem, let alone a
well,
massive one.
yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because the beginning, I'll tell you something, the beginning of climate change policy around the world was the Earth Summit, which took place in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in 1992. And that was the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. Now, you figure it's coming from the UN,
Mm-hmm.
which focuses a lot on developing countries. Uh, and it's a conference on environment and development. So you'd think, gee, I guess the topics are going to be water pollution, indoor air pollution, the problems of developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, what came out of there are two conventions, because, in other words, international agreements, because it was successfully captured by the North, by the wealthier countries, and indeed by environmental advocacy groups, probably like the one I used to work for. I mentioned the Environmental Defense Fund, because what they were concerned about was not these problems in developing countries. The two issues they cared about, which led to these two conventions. One is the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and the other is the Biodiversity Convention, because people were very concerned about biodiversity, which, from the perspective of the Brazilians at the time, was essentially something like, and I'm, making this up, but an American coming and saying, oh, by the way, in the United States, we tore down our forest and in many cases grasslands, plowed them under in the 19th century so we could have agricultural land. That became the basis of industrialization, which led to the growth of our economy. Sorry, we don't want you to do that. Leave the Amazon forest alone.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was what they were concerned about. And likewise for biodiversity. I mean, if you're living in a small village, people, the people that I knew, for example, in, West Africa, uh, in a very small village, there are a few hundred people. I was in a grass mud hut where no one spoke any language other than Mende, the tribal language. And the people there were very at home with the environment because it was a very basic society. It didn't do anything that was really in any way affecting the environment. The environment affected them. And so, from their point of view, the idea of protecting biodiversity, as opposed to having enough food to eat, healthcare, if possible, education, it was a completely different rank ordering, which I assume you can understand.
Yeah, it
And
makes sense.
yeah.
Off of that note, like, do you think it's changing? Do you think it's changing for the better? Like, because that was a while ago. Like, we
Yeah, no,
progressed a
that was a
lot.
while ago. Well, the situation in many developing countries has, it would be wonderful, I could tell you it had changed, but in terms of if you look at per capita income in poor countries of the world, and West Africa is a good example, but it's not the only very poor countries, that the ratio of income, per capita income annually in those countries to the wealthiest countries of the world um, has either not changed or the ratio is now even greater. In other words,
Wow.
that relatively speaking, they're not getting wealthier. Now, there are some countries which we now think of as middle income countries that have gotten wealthier in terms of per capita income. I mean, since 1992, the per capita income in China has increased by 3,000%. 3,000. So if you think of the large emerging economies, China, India, Brazil, Korea, South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia. Well, there has been tremendous economic growth, but that's a very different story from many countries in sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of Latin America and some parts of Southeast Asia and also India for that matter.
Another thing too that I'm thinking of is whose responsibility is it to kind of help them develop more so that they can focus on these other issues that are affecting the environment? Would you say you brought up a little bit about the different organizations? Would you say that these organizations are creating an impact, I guess, worthy of the budget or worthy of the effort or the responsibility that we put into them? I'm sure they're trying their best, but is the impact they're making actually correlating the amount of resources that we give them?
Well, so I think of the like the U.S. environmental advocacy groups, the which are and they're much more important in the U.S. than environmental advocacy groups are in Europe. In Europe, there's a very different situation, which is it's within the political party system. So the Green Party in European countries is very important. They're sort of, in a sense, analogous, but they're within government, within the parliament. They're sort of analogous to the role that's played in our more pluralistic system of environmental grab. I know we have a Green Party, but it's trivial.
Yeah.
Mainly have the two major parties. Um, so there are different situations in different countries of the world, and I think the environmental advocacy groups now are in the U.S. for the most part are focused on climate change. That's for some of them, that's all they do.
Really? So they're not even focused on outreach at all? Like, isn't that also directly impacting climate change too? Like, we all share the same world.
You mean outreach to other countries?
Correct. Yeah.
No, they're mainly focused on the U.S. and on the international policy dimensions of climate change. In other words, things like, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, that sort of thing. But most are not. Now, there is an exception to that, I should mention. The World Resources Institute, which is in Washington, D.C., which is not quite an advocacy group. I don't think it has a legal arm that's filing lawsuits, but it's in that direction. They're very engaged. They're probably more engaged in the developing world than in any other part of the world, including the U.S.
Okay. Well, my next question was centered around like why is Europe better than the U.S. when it comes to these things, but it makes sense. I mean, if the Green Party is so trivial in the U.S., so that becomes like a bipartisan issue, and now we're arguing over the small things, and the Green Party in European countries is so strong compared to ours. They have much higher voice and much more of an important voice, I think, too. So kind of tackles my next area. Switching gears a little bit, I kind of want to hit AI versus climate and kind of like the background price that we pay. So when I was doing research for this, one of the main things that hit me is that this isn't new. Like, not necessarily the problem, but the idea of the problem, where we always have like some sort of innovation that changes and has some sort of cost behind it. One of the main ones I noticed was oils and cars. Like the whole oil industry, we were promised like mobility, freedom, all these other things, which is true. We were given that, but the cost was smog, climate change, oil dependency, millions of lives lost in car crashes when you look at it. Another good one is plastics, microplastics being the cost there. and so on and so forth. Even social media, you can say, is one of those cases. Looking at AI, the consumption rates are ridiculous. It's actually ridiculous. For ChatGPT, for it's 700 million queries a day. 700 million. And sorry, 700 million daily queries. And then that equates to 35,000 US homes in terms of energy cost. So it's taking up a lot of energy. If you even look at it too, like the water consumption, it's 1.3 to 1.6 million kiloliters of water. That's about 500 Olympic pools. So kind of what I'm trying to get at is we have all this consumption. We know we have all this consumption. This is not a question. What can we do to stop this pattern?
Well, I think the trade-offs are inevitable, and I wouldn't, and you can't always address the trade-off itself, but one can try. I mean, another trade-off, which is not in magnitude, is not as great as what we're seeing now over the last several years with AI, is just electrification of the transportation sector. So, if you decide to get an electric vehicle rather than your gasoline or diesel powered vehicle, so, you might feel that, oh, that's great for the environment, and it is for localized air pollution that comes out of the tailpipe of an automobile, for example. I should say that. But in terms of carbon dioxide, now what you've done is that you've shifted to electricity. Now, electric vehicles, in an engineering sense, are actually more efficient than internal combustion engines. So it's not going to be the same. It's not one to one. But if you live in Colorado and now you've increased electricity demand for your electric vehicle charging, and you're essentially getting coal-fired power, unlike Massachusetts, where it's going to be renewable or hydro that's imported down from Canada, or a little bit of renewable. It's a very different situation. So you could have, and this is a huge problem. I mean, increasing electrification, and it's been happening in the U.S., even more so in China, of course, and and in Europe, is increasing energy demand. Now, if electricity demand, now if the grid is moving systematically from fossil fuels to renewables, then in terms of climate change, well, that's okay. That's a positive result. But if it's not, then you have a problem. And so that applies to AI. So there is tremendous increase in demand for electricity. The big challenge both is electricity transmission. So one of the problems is that as we go to more renewables, and obviously there was a big push for that under the Inflation Reduction Act and other aspects of the Biden administration policy, obviously now being turned around by the Trump administration. The big challenge either way is getting the electricity, from the source to the demand. And the source of wind power and the sunniest areas of the country are not necessarily where the biggest cities are. So it's always a challenge. Now, the AI industry, they've addressed this quite directly. They're building the information farms where the computers are very, very close to power plants. In fact, there were movements to build next to wind farms, but even more so next to sources of solar energy, because otherwise the transmission itself becomes a huge problem.
Is that why it's a state right issue? Because
Pardon me?
is that why it's a states rights issue?
Well,
Um,
it's a state issue if it is within a state. If electricity is passing across borders, state borders, then it comes under the regulation of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. And so they have jurisdiction instead. That's also true of natural gas pipelines if they're in a state as opposed to interstate.
okay, yeah, that makes sense. That checks out. Because the way I was thinking about it was why do we even allow states to kind of worry about this issue? Why can't we just all make one big switch to renewable energy? I mean, that's the only thing that makes sense. Also, kind of on a completely unrelated note, what is the push against nuclear energy? Where does that stem from? Is that just like a political issue just to get votes, or is that more of like, are there actual implications of negative results coming from nuclear energy? Because like a lot of people in my generation are pushing for nuclear energy to exist. So if you can just clarify that a little bit.
Oh, so that's interesting. So there is a lot of hostility in the US and in Europe, and in Japan for that matter, to nuclear power. Now, obviously, from the perspective of climate change, that's very bad news because nuclear power is like hydropower or solar or wind. It's absolutely uh, climate neutral. Um, but there is a fear in the US and in parts of Europe. The Green Party in Europe is very hostile towards nuclear energy, for example. Places like Germany, the one part of Europe that has a high reliance on nuclear power for generating electricity is France, but there's a lot of hostility in other places. In the United States, we were building a lot of power plants in the post-war period, 50s and 60s, and then it stopped. Two things worked against it. One was the NIMBY problem, not in my backyard. People might feel okay about a nuclear power plant, but they didn't want one near them. Now,
Yeah.
they also don't want a coal-fired power plant with stacks that go up 20 floors to be near them. So part of it was the NIMBY, but part of it was also more broad-based fear and opposition from the environmental advocacy groups. Now they've changed their tune because of climate change, but they were also opposed. And at first it was just worrying about a meltdown. I mean, 3 Mile Island, which happened, decades ago now, a partial meltdown. It's the only time we've had even a partial meltdown of a plant in the US. That, and then there was a movie about it. And that galvanized two movies, I guess, actually, and that galvanized public opinion. In addition to that, partly because of the opposition, there was very tight regulation on the construction of nuclear power plants. That drove up the cost. But even besides the effective regulation, nuclear power was and is very expensive because it's very capital intensive. It's just much more expensive to build a nuclear power plant. Now, the operating costs are close to zero. So it's sort of like a hydroelectric. The dam and the reservoir have huge upfront costs, and then the operating costs are almost zero. And so nuclear is the same way, but the upfront cost of just the capital cost of building a nuclear power plant, together with the environmental concerns, that's what killed the nuclear power industry in the U.S. Now,
Okay.
it may turn around. But,
Do you think it's going to turn around anytime soon?
well, if the current administration, one of their big pushes, the one area in which they're very enthusiastic about carbon-free energy is nuclear power. It's going to take a lot to change it because of the strong political opposition to it. I mean, when I say got political opposition, I really mean grassroots.
Oh, really?
Yeah, local communities are very fearful of nuclear power. So, for example, when the nuclear power plant Fukushima in Japan um, was put out of commission by a tsunami that caused a flood through the nuclear power plant, over a huge area, Japan closed all generation from all nuclear power plants, which were ones that were inland. So they had nothing to do with that. And now here's what will really get you is that Germany, because of Fukushima, Germany then immediately suspended all construction of new nuclear power plants. Now, France didn't, but Germany did. And the reason was they said, oh, nuclear power is more dangerous than we thought. Well, Germany doesn't have to worry about tsunamis.
Yeah.
But
Do you think it's the
anyway,
media weaponizing it?
well, the news media is typically amplification of what others think. Now, there are exceptions to that. I suppose Fox News in the US is amplifying itself. It has its own views and it amplifies those. But
Mhm.
largely, the news media are amplifying what it is that the interest groups, or I hope the academic community in some cases, uh, or others are saying. So the news media is very important. I mean, they're just extremely important in everything that affects policy.
Yeah. Well, I guess that answers my question there. Now, changing gears, but kind of on the same topic. I think this is going to be the last question we could hit. Do you think academics such as yourself, someone who's been in this field for so long and has contributed a lot to it, do you think that you have a responsibility to the government, more so to creating policy? And if you do you think that kind of responsibility actually gets taken by the people who you are sending this message to? Do politicians actually take your opinion and value it and try to use it when they're creating different policies or moving on with certain ideas?
Well, that's actually an important question. I think for the most part, um, analysis, scientific analysis, economic analysis in government, that analysis can either serve in theory, as a light bulb or a rock. By which I mean a light bulb that it illuminates the situation. And the policymakers say, oh, what those people at Worcester Polytechnic Institute studied and told us about, I guess that's really interesting. We should change the policy. That very rarely happens, whether it's Worcester or it's Harvard. It just
Mm-hmm.
doesn't happen a lot. What's much more common is that the analysis works as a rock, that someone who, for political reasons, because of their constituencies or for ideology or for a host of reasons, favors a particular policy. And then you do an analysis at Worcester or Harvard that supports that, then they use that analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like it changed their mind. So does analysis get used in the halls of government? Absolutely, it gets used.
Yeah.
But it's rare that it changes minds. I could quote you times that it has changed minds. I think climate change is definitely one of those, that government is responding to what's come from the scientific community and from the economics community, in the case of the social cost of carbon. But more often, policymakers are operating with their political priors. And that's why, I never bother to testify anymore at House or Senate hearings, because you're just called either by the majority or the minority because they know that you're going to agree with what they want to hear said.
Yeah.
So,
It's funny how that works. It's funny how that works. I guess that concludes all the questions. And that concludes everything for this podcast. I wish we had more time because there's like a bunch of different things I wanted to get into, but we touched on very, very important ones. Mainly when you see kind of a academic face in Congress, um, recognize why that's there. That's a really important one. Do you ever see like a shift? Do you think like maybe in the future we have the chance to actually kind of apply more importance to academia within politics?
well, that also is interesting you ask, because as you may know, and if you don't, we should really emphasize this fact. The current administration, which is doing everything it can to attack all sorts of elite institutions, has a vendetta against academia and against academic research. The National Institute of Health has stopped all funding, for cancer research to universities across the country. This is not just Harvard, this is the University of Texas, wherever it is.
Mm-hmm.
So this administration and Mr. Trump are very, very uh, anti-intellectual and anti-university. Now, there's a sense in which we shouldn't be surprised by that, because the history of autocracies, if you don't mind my saying so, the history of autocracies, whether they're in Latin America or the 1930s in Germany and the rise of the Nazi Party, one of the first things they always do is go after the universities, go after them, then go after the news media. That because those are those who want to tell the truth. And so the fact that the current administration, which in my mind is, evolving now into autocracy, um, fits very much that mold. I'm sorry to end this on such a negative note, but
It's a
I think
necessary one.
that's the reality.
So, one last thing. Do you have any different topics that you think our viewers should kind of research more in order to get a better understanding of problems that we've never heard of, problems that we'll never really hear of from the media? You could just list the subjects out or the different ideas out.
Well, I don't know if I could list subjects, but let me say something else that is important for your audience is that If you ask me the very broad question of, am I hopeful for the future in terms of climate change, for example, in terms of climate change, my answer is yes, I am hopeful. And it's because of you. It's because of you and your listeners. It's because of young people, because we see a systematic change. When I went to primary school, you didn't hear about climate change. When I went to high school, you didn't hear about it. When I went to college, but now my kids, when they went to primary school, they learn about it. In high school, they learn about it. And everyone in college. I mean, at Harvard, I've turned the people away. The students are extremely interested. So we're seeing a systematic change. Now, the big question, and I don't know the answer, is whether or not this is a cohort effect. And when those people get older, instead of being protesting outside of the Congress, they'll be sitting in Congress. Or whether it's an age effect, and as they get older, they'll become more conservative, as most people do as they get older. And I don't have the answer to that, but my hope, my very strong hope, and I think my expectation is that your generation's going to save us. So there's some responsibility on you.
Definitely. One last question, kind of. You mentioned how these ideas are being brought up in classrooms. What is not being brought up in a classroom that should be brought up in a classroom right now?
Well, I think the trade-offs, I mean, we bring it up in my classrooms, but I think too often people do not give adequate attention to the trade-offs. They look at a particular problem and they think, okay, we're going to address that problem and any policy is going to be good for it. But then what are the costs? And I don't just mean economic costs. There are benefits of most action. There are most actions. There are costs of most actions. One of the things that economics forces us to do is to look at both the good news and the bad news. And it's inevitably there. So I would love to see more attention to that in classrooms.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time. That'll be it for today. I really do appreciate you coming on here. And yeah, thank you for listening. Bye.
It was my pleasure.